Maybe we should take a break?
Your turn.
I am creating a show-accurate version of CardWars from Adventure Time, but don't worry if you aren't caught up because I'll catch you up before anything else. But before that, the fully public alpha playtest is available right now in the Steam Workshop for Tabletop Simulator. There is a link in the description. With the playtest out, you can assume all the basics for a card game are covered. Turn structure, placeholder cards, combat, simulated behaviors, and of course an economy to auction for your opponent's cards. Last video, I talked a lot about adding lands to the game, since unlike other card games, CardWars has a board with elemental lands that influence the creatures in play. However, this video is going to refocus on the worker placement mechanic in the economy more so than lands. I decided to put a bit of a pin in adding overcomplexity to lands because I need to test their base functions a bit more first. And even more so, to test lands fully, I will need elemental decks to pair and synergize with them, which I don't have and will take time. I've also been thinking about deck building since I know a lot of people hate the randomness from the current system, so I'll talk a little bit about that at the end. Although worker placement is the most complex thing I've been working on, my main focus is actually just finding ways to encourage more aggressive play. We did a members-only tournament, and while some matches were very quick, others were extremely long. There are a lot of variables, and one of them is several really good cards have slow burn strategies. But in general, a lot of the overarching mechanics of the game reward you for waiting and hoarding. Once I fix the cards, which will of course happen once I begin working on actual decks, the other three main culprits of slowing the game down are combat being too balanced, holding onto bad cards, and playing overly defensive for the economy. Combat being too balanced sounds like an odd issue, but right now that means in order to justify attacking, you will often want to build up a significant advantage or wait to use creatures that have very high base stats. In order to encourage aggressive play, which would speed the game up, the attacker should have some sort of advantage so the player would be more likely to advance. The discard and draw mechanic also pushes waiting, since at the start of your turn, you discard then draw, instead of just drawing. It's best to just wait and hope your last bad card will get replaced next turn, which leaves you and your opponent in the hands of a lot of RNG. Hoarding in the economy is the most straightforward issue that I have right now, but a very tricky thing to solve. Right now, you flip cards to get money, but it makes them vulnerable. Money lets you get cards, so it's a very good strategy to just bunker up and defend your money producers. Money should probably be made a tad weaker, so it'll force the player to take riskier actions that will force them to take space before they can safely get money. With the current flipping system, you turtle to get money, so we just tested the polar opposite. Every time you remove an enemy piece, gain 1 money. This honestly worked pretty alright, although I didn't like grabbing money after each removal. As nitpicky as that sounds, it just felt too regular of an action. And I couldn't ignore that something felt overall wrong about it, which took me a while to actually quantify. When we were testing it, nothing else about the game had really been changed, so while the aggressive money gain encouraged the aggressive play, the base game itself was relying on it as the function to do so. Even if the economy wasn't optional, the foundations of the game should be pushing a faster playstyle on its own, which means when playing with the economy, you'll be rewarded with money for doing the thing you're already being encouraged to do, and it'll just end up adding money to every game without you even thinking about it. I think the economy should be more of its own strategy, like it is now. Something you deliberately choose to focus on if you create an opportunity, but isn't in every game unless you will it. But that doesn't mean it can stay the same, obviously, because it needs to do that while not rewarding slow play like it currently does. It should probably just encourage some sort of neutral pace, I suppose, if that even makes sense. I wanted to rip apart the economy a tad and rebuild worker placement, which I said last time was not show accurate and not really worker placement either, according to other people. Which is impressive on my end if you think about it. I managed to add something that checked 0 boxes to the game without even noticing. One of the biggest things I needed to incorporate was the concept of a 1 worker slot that both players can compete over, like is shown in the episode where a scholar boots a corn guy off of a marked spot. The idea I had for slots was actually the lanes themselves. If there can only be 1 worker in each lane, you could put one down in a land to make it so your opponent cannot do it opposite. Workers might also need to be a distinct piece to be considered a worker placement mechanic, but that's tricky because introducing new pieces like that is something I'd really like to avoid. It wouldn't be the end of the world, but it's just nice to be able to use the creatures that are already in play. My current idea is that workers straddle the kingdom border in their lane, and can be attacked from either side without being able to defend themselves. That way, you would have to clear out the opposing land in order to safely place a worker. This ended up being way too risky. Besides, to do this, you have to essentially put a creature on the line when it could be doing something else productive anyway. Having workers be a distinct piece would mitigate that, since you wouldn't be putting one of your limited creatures on the line. In testing, this wasn't terrible. We were more comfortable placing workers down, but it was either too easy and free to do so, or still wasted the action of a card on the field, since the initial idea was that you exhaust a creature to place a worker in its lane. I'm sure there's more to explore there, but I still wanted to avoid these new worker meeples, so I went back and reviewed the footage from the show. The creatures are standing on these black circles, so I'll just throw those onto the board, since this clip obviously takes place on the board somewhere. Also, I never noticed that both of the creatures are blue. Sure, one is Corn and one is a Scholar, but you could hypothetically have both of those in the same deck. Besides, if the creatures had a natural, quote, unaligned color, then the corn man definitely wouldn't be blue. To be honest, this doesn't really matter that much, it's just weird, and I guess means the worker placement mechanic doesn't necessarily need to be aggressive. So we started using the black circles. I don't know, I'll call them worker slots for now. There are a few things left to be determined about them, but in general, the idea is that your creatures can move onto a worker slot, and then at the start of your turn, you gain a gold for each of your creatures on worker slots. Most of our previous systems had you take the money the moment you committed a creature and not at the start of your next turn. But with the worker slots, the creatures can still defend themselves, so they aren't nearly as vulnerable. You can then choose to keep the worker on the slot or not at the start of your turn, and of course, a different creature can then exhaust to take the spot, so there's my explanation for the clip in the show. There are lots of weird edge cases that we had to iron out when testing, like if creatures could be moved or teleported and whatnot, but the biggest thing was that with the current rules, structures on a land always participate in fights, so that you can distribute damage to them. But exhausted creatures don't participate in fights. So a land with a working creature and a structure, you have to fight the structure first. It ends up sort of defending the creature, which doesn't really make any sense. By the way, if you want access to our next playtest 1 week early, developer live streams, and sneak peek teasers, or just want to support us in general, please consider becoming a member. Thanks so much for making this possible. I tried to make structures fit into the combat rules as if they were just creatures that didn't have attack values. In the current system, the defender distributes the damage between all participating structures and creatures, so the point was that you could allow structures to soak up damage for your creatures to create a bit more of a home field advantage. The simple change for now, without overhauling the damage and targeting mechanics, is to make structures simply take the spillover damage and can't be targeted or have damage distributed to them unless all allied creatures are dead there. This means now creatures will end up defending structures inherently, which probably only feels weird because the structures in the game currently are less valuable than the creatures by a long shot. It will also make being aggressive feel a little bit better too, since you won't be punching a wall when you attack creatures in their own kingdom. This damage distribution stuff relates to what I was talking about with overbalanced combat earlier. Everything right now is too even, and it's not really favorable to be aggressive. On the other hand though, if combat is too attacker-sided, the first player will absolutely sweep every game. Whoever goes first already has a huge advantage, and unfortunately that is completely show accurate, but I'd still rather not exacerbate the issue. Ideally, I'd like to introduce an attacker side buff that somehow can't be fully utilized by the first player. It would be easy to place simple restrictions on parts of the game, like the first player could only attack with one creature or something, but if we take those shortcuts, they will pile up and make a game full of what I call helicopter parent rules, things that you can't do just because I said so. There are also alternate ways to think about this instead of just fixating on the first player, like somehow buffing the second player on the first player's turn. I have some ideas I'll test for the next video. The last thing I brought up that was slowing the game down was waiting to draw better cards. If you only have one card in hand and it sucks, it's best to wait until you discard and draw to see if you get something better, since if you have no cards in hand, you can no longer draw cards. This is a tricky one to fix, but having better deck synergies as a result of more cohesive elemental decks would likely reduce the feeling of having a useless card in hand. But even with a handcrafted deck, you'd still have cards that aren't great in every single situation. Changing mechanics like this is hard since I'm not just making a game, it also has to be show accurate, so I can't ditch the discard and draw. Right now I don't feel like this is worth a deep dive though, because I haven't implemented the better decks yet, so this might become a non-issue anyway. Now, deck building. This has been a huge point of contention. Right now there is no form of deck building, and there are two reasons. One refers to the playtest. In the playtest, there are 80 wildly unbalanced cards, so you can make your own deck if you want, but I don't think the game will function at all. The other reason is because I personally think it adds to the chaotic and spontaneous nature of Card Wars. Not knowing what you could draw next is exciting, and it keeps you on your toes and adaptable. We also see lots of really bad cards and creatures in people's decks, and I think that this is part of the game. Having a variety and power makes the game feel totally different from other card games I've played. That said, I hear you, and I have plans for a solution that will satisfy almost everything that I want, and of course give you deck building. So, when you pick the 4 lands that you want, you can select 6 cards per land from its corresponding element to make a deck. However, aside from having powers, the lands you choose also come with forced additions which might be good or bad. The standard cornfield might force you to add 3 cornmen to your deck or something. These things will add fodder and a variety to decks, but still be totally under your control. It doesn't capture the chaotic nature that I want, and I can't really test it until I have more cards, which I'm currently working on. But in general, I'd like to just remind everyone out there that you can play board games however you want. If my deck building system is not to your liking, then when you're playing with your friends, you can just do it however you'd like. The only hang up to that would be real tournament games, but most people won't have to worry about that, and if you like the game enough to play tournaments, then I'd hope you like the base game rules anyway. Alright, I know you've all missed Globulin, he's just been busy. Sifting around at the bottom isn't as easy as it sounds. But here he is, and it's time to go over some notes. Viewers who were paying attention might have spotted the custom meeples I made. Turns out it's super easy in Tabletop Simulator, and you can just import transparent background silhouettes as tokens with the thickness turned all the way up. It's weird though, if you try to recolor them in the game, the normals get a bit messed up. I was afraid of calling cards created by other cards tokens like they do in Magic, because in a game with pieces, calling a card a token might be confusing to people who don't play Magic. I called them scion cards since that means descendant or offspring sorta, but now I realize I should just call them spawn cards and get rid of the spawn tag I put on some creatures. It's less weird and makes way more sense. So from the playtest, I learned a lot about card creation for this game, mostly things to stay away from when making cards going forwards, which is obviously super great. I'm going to stay away from cards and effects that spawn tons of one thing unless there is a more direct thought out strategy and restriction to the ability. I will limit the amount of cards that have slow burn game plans like Summoning Circle and Worm Church, which reward players for hanging back and waiting. Tags should maybe mean more, I'm just worried they'll flood the cards with more text, and I'm also going to have to get used to working the land cards into more abilities. The most powerful cards in an element should rely on their lands more than other cards so that you can't take only the best cards from an element if you're deck building with just one of a land of an element. I'm also thinking about adding a defense mode for creatures or something. I want a few more options to strategize without having to play cards. Maybe not special abilities like I've brought up before, but if I had to give examples, things like push, dash, or grapple. I probably won't do any of those ideas, but simple things like them, without inducing crazy decision paralysis, hopefully. Okay, well that's that. I can't imagine Globulin made much progress even in all that time, so I'm sure he's happy to go back. Bye bye! Subscribing is free, and you can even do it right at home. You'll just get to see our uploads once a week, and you can always unsubscribe later. Regardless, thanks for watching everyone, and yes, I still know about the mobile game, I have not forgotten.